Hi everyone, and welcome back to a Niger Man's Perspective. If you're new for the first time or you're returning and you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. But before that, give me a big fat like, because that will help the algorithm and send my video to more people to come back here. And in turn, I continue to make more videos, but please, it'll be a nice gesture to do it. So let's get into it. Fuel crisis. Nigeria and fuel crisis. Anyone who is Nigerian or has been to Nigeria or has anything to do with Nigeria will know that we have this ever-going fuel crisis situation. There's fuel crisis, then it stops, then there's fuel crisis, then it stops, and the price goes up. There's fuel crisis again, the price goes up. There's fuel crisis again, and the price goes up. It never comes down. It always just goes up. As of 2024 September, Nigeria is facing a deepening fuel crisis, which is characterized by skyrocketing prices and severe shortages that have led to widespread hardship. It impacts everything in Nigeria. All the logistics, getting to work, transportation costs, food prices, because the fuel prices is going to lead to higher transportation, and the people who are selling the food will pass on the cost to the final consumer. So just hardship after hardship after hardship. Petrol prices have surged to as high as 900 naira per liter. Some people are buying it for 850. A couple of weeks ago, some people were buying for at least 1,200 naira on the black market. This is up from 185 naira per liter, I think, in early 2023. Some Nigerians have even reported paying over 1,000 naira, like I said, on the black market as they struggle to access fuel for daily needs. Now, petrol isn't just used for cars to go from point A to point B. People are also using petrol to fuel their generators at home, because electricity isn't widespread in the country. So petrol is used for a variety of things in Nigeria. This crisis stems from the removal of fuel subsidies by the President Bola Tinubu's administration, which was implemented to address Nigeria's fiscal deficit, but has had severe consequences on the population. So you might ask, what's causing this? What's causing this fuel crisis? So like I mentioned, number one, subsidy removal. The removal of the fuel subsidy was a bold economic reform, it must be said, aimed at saving the government billions of naira annually. So for decades, Nigeria maintained subsidies that kept petrol prices artificially low, but this was unsustainable given the country's high debt levels and reliance on oil revenues. So the Nigerian government spends way more of its budget on recurrent expenditure than capital expenditure. So think about, paying salaries and all that kind of stuff. So this is unsustainable, and this present administration wanted to reverse that. Now, by removing this subsidy, the government had hoped to stabilize the economy, but this move led to significant rise in fuel prices and increased inflation across all sectors. And many experts have said, removing the subsidy, what has been put in its place? Let's go to the second point. Currency devaluation. Nigeria imports the majority of its refined fuel. The same crude oil that we have, we are not able to refine it, right? So we have to import the majority of the refined fuel, because the crude oil which we have in the natural state in Nigeria, we can't use it for our petrol needs and the energy needs I mentioned earlier. So we export this crude oil which we get naturally, we export it, and then we re-import it as a refined product. So the best way I can think about this, to make it easy for everyone watching, is we have cocoa. Ghana has cocoa, but Ghana exports. I'm using Ghana as an example. I think Nigeria too has cocoa, but Ghana has more cocoa than Nigeria. So let's say, using Ghana as an example, Ghana has cocoa. Ghana exports the cocoa to the UK. The UK turned the cocoa into chocolate bars like Mars, Twix, etc., and then exports it back to Ghana, and then Ghana buys the chocolate, and people start to consume the chocolate in its finished product, because you can't eat the cocoa raw. Anyway, let's get back into it. So back to currency devaluation. This is because Nigeria's refining capacity is extremely limited. With the Naira's continued devaluation against the US dollar, the cost of importing fuel has risen sharply. This has further contributed to the fuel price hike, as Nigeria's oil sector remains vulnerable to global oil price fluctuations. Point number 3, Dangote refinery and hopes for relief. I did a video on the Dangote refinery situation, Dangote versus Federal Republic of Nigeria. You should check it out somewhere on my channel. Nigerians are hopeful that the Dangote refinery, Africa's largest and extremely laudable project, probably the biggest project in the whole of Africa, will alleviate the situation by reducing the country's dependence on imported fuel. Once operational, the refinery is expected to refine about 650,000 barrels of oil per day. I say once operational because there have been some snags, which I covered in my earlier video on the Dangote subject. However, experts are warning that this may not immediately translate into lower fuel prices due to the complex pricing structures in Nigeria's oil sector, which I will not be going into in this video. Now, what are the pain points for Nigerians? I mentioned earlier that it's really, really hard, and it is. The fuel crisis is having a devastating effect. Guys, you would not even imagine how much of a devastating effect this is causing on the Nigerian economy and people's day-to-day lives. Transportation costs, like I mentioned earlier, have skyrocketed, making it more expensive for people to commute to work, transport goods, access essential services. Businesses, especially small and medium scale enterprises, are also struggling with higher costs for running generators, like I mentioned earlier, in the face of Nigeria's unreliable power supply. Like I said, additionally, food prices and inflation are climbing, putting even more pressure on the average Nigerian. There is a political angle to this. The fuel crisis has sparked significant political tension. The Nigerian government is under immense pressure to provide relief, while opposition parties and civil society organizations are criticizing the administration's handling of the crisis. Some argue that removing the subsidy without sufficient support for the most vulnerable populations has worsened inequality and deepened economic distress. Are they lying? Calls for increased transparency in fuel pricing and government interventions to protect consumers are growing louder. But the government isn't sitting idle. They're not sitting idle. Now, I've talked a lot. I've talked about the fuel crisis. I've talked about the pain points. I've talked about the causes. Now, you need to understand Nigeria's oil industry. So let me just take us a bit backwards. Nigeria's oil industry is divided into 3 main sectors. You've got the upstream sector, you've got the midstream sector, and you've got the downstream sector. Each of these sectors play a crucial role in the country's fuel production and distribution processes. The upstream sector. This sector focuses on the exploration and production of crude oil and natural gas. Companies in this sector find and extract oil from underground reserves, both onshore and offshore. Nigeria has vast oil reserves, but inefficiencies and underinvestment have prevented the country from fully benefiting from its resources. Issues like oil thefts, bunkering, pipeline vandalism, and environmental damage in the Niger Delta have also hampered production. Then we have the midstream sector, which handles the transportation, like I mentioned earlier, storage and processing of the crude oil. This is a crucial link between the oil fields and the refineries. In Nigeria, the midstream sector is heavily reliant on pipelines and shipping to transport crude oil. However, Outdated infrastructure and security challenges have made transportation costly and inefficient, contributing to the high cost of fuel. Stay with me, guys. Then we have the downstream. The downstream sector is responsible for refining crude oil into finished products such as petrol, diesel, and jet fuel, which is used for planes, helicopters, etc. It involves the distribution and marketing of these products. Unfortunately, Nigeria's downstream sector has struggled due to the country's reliance on imported refined fuel, like I mentioned earlier. The limited capacity of local refineries and the high cost of imports have driven up prices at the pump. The development of Dangote refinery is expected to play a key role in reviving the downstream sector. Let us see how that goes over the next years. We're hoping and rooting Dangote refinery is a success. The current refineries in the country, I'm not going to go into that in this video. They're not working. Let's just move on that one. We want this to work. It's going to open a lot of doors for a lot of people countrywide, not individuals, but hopefully at some point it will revive the downstream sector, and at some point it may bring down the prices. We'll see. Now, what is the way forward? For Nigeria to overcome its current fuel crisis, several steps are essential. Nigeria needs to invest in refineries. Expanding local refinery capacity will be critical to reducing Nigeria's reliance on fuel imports. This will not only lower costs, but also insulate the country from global oil price volatility. Stabilizing the Naira will all help control the rising cost of fuel imports. This may involve better management of foreign exchange reserves and fostering economic diversification. The government will need to implement social safety nets to protect the poorest Nigerians from the economic fallout of fuel price hikes, ensuring that the burden of reform does not fall disproportionately on those least able to bear it. I'm talking about the elderly. I'm talking about the people who have retired. I'm talking about the most vulnerable populations in the country. In conclusion, Nigeria's fuel crisis is a very complex issue driven by a combination of subsidy removal, like I mentioned, currency devaluation, and underinvestment in critical sectors. While there are hopes for relief through the Dangote refinery and other infrastructure projects, the road ahead remains difficult for the average Nigerian struggling with the high cost of living. The government faces a delicate balancing act of reforming the oil sector while protecting its citizens from further economic pain. If you've enjoyed this, please give this video a big like, subscribe to my channel, and share this with as many people as possible. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one.